So we're going to talk a little bit about 4 different theorists and psychologists. We're going to talk about Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, and Carl Rogers. We're going to talk about the differences between these and a bit of a summary of what they kind of do and what they think. So Carl Jung is really famous for his collective unconscious idea and his archetypes. So the collective unconscious is, he believes we have an instinct or like the inner drive that makes us aware of our surroundings and environment, and it's something that is biological, that's just part of us because we're humans. We've got like a instinct or intuition. Then the archetypes are basically roles, like human roles that we play into that exist everywhere we look. So some of those archetypes would be the Joker, the magician, even like mother figure, like that is a role and an archetype of itself, or like queen. They're all examples of things we play into, kind of like a character. Alfred Adler is really known for his like superiority complex, which he believes comes from a feeling of inferiority. Then we've got Freud, who is known for his like iceberg analogy and having like the things under the iceberg which are unconscious, and then the things in the middle which are preconscious, and then on top which is conscious. And he talks about like the id, the ego, and the superego. Then Carl Rogers, who talks about that all forms of psychopathologies come from a feeling of incongruence. So when your self-image and your true image is incongruent, it just means they're inconsistent. So I'll dive into the first one. So Carl Jung, him and Freud's theories are quite similar because they both talk about self and ego and unconscious processes, and they both break it down into like concepts that can be used to understand what's going on deep in the mind. So Jung has this aspect of the self, which is the shadow. And the shadow is our repressed urges, the things that have kind of been shunned to the outer limits of our consciousness that we can't really reach. We can't reach easily. We could reach with like psychotherapy or questioning, journaling, even like free flows of consciousness, like word association. There's different methods to get there, but it's hard. And he also thinks that the shadow is there for a reason, and it's there to kind of protect the ego or the self, because they're things that aren't comfortable to look at, or things that have, there's a reason why we've put them in the shunned spot or the shunned place. So the other part of the self that is included in Jung's view is the persona and the ego. The persona is like a mask that we put on that makes us interact with the world in the way that we think it wants us to. Like kind of like social norms, cultural norms, what is comfortable for our external environment, like how we're supposed to act basically. And then the ego is like our identity, or our kind of like script of ourselves, what we think of ourselves. And then we've got like our self, which is like a combination of all those things. So Sigmund Freud's theory is similar to Jung in the fact that he also talks about an ego. He describes the ego as a conscious thing that mediates between the superego, which is basically our morals, or kind of like that mask, that persona mask of Jung. So that persona Freud has something similar to the persona of Jung, which is the superego, which is the morals. How do you think the persona and the superego is kind of linked, or how do you see them distinguished?
Well, I guess your superego would inform what your persona is. Do you think?
Yeah, so you see, like, so the superego would be like one step above the persona.
Below.
It would be below the persona.
Well, the persona would be built off the superego.
That's interesting because I kind of saw the superego as like top tier and the persona below, just because it's like being crafted by the morals and by like the right and wrong.
Well, in terms of like power and how things are made, the superego would be on top. But if the persona is the thing that you're like putting out, then that would be on top.
And then how would you look at the differences between the ego in both of their theories? Freud views the ego as just like a moderator of the id, like impulses. And then Jung is just like, it's the identity.
Yeah, I don't know. They kind of all like are interlocking.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because Freud's theory was the first. So Jung kind of bases even the wording, like the ego, off Freud, who created that kind of terminology. So yeah, it's interesting to think about it. And like the part that we haven't explained yet is Freud's id, which I kind of alluded to just before. But the id is your wants or your needs, and it's viewed as like very childlike because it's just like instant urges and like almost very like primitive, like wanting food and wanting it now. And then your ego has to moderate that with its superego. And the superego is the morals and the constraints and the right and wrong of how we're going to feed this id, or how we're going to get what we want, but still adhere to the morals of our superego. And then, so in that view, the ego is just kind of like going back and forth in this tug of war of like, I want this now, okay, but I'm limited by like what I actually can do because I want to be viewed as like accepted socially. So yeah, it's interesting. And then Jung doesn't really have any of that moral ideas. He just...
Well, it's kind of built into the shadow though.
How so?
Well, you wouldn't really, like the ego wouldn't have a need to hide it unless it was right or wrong.
Do you think that's based off like... Do you think that's like a society right and wrong, or do you think it's like a personal right or wrong?
Well, I don't know. It depends what you personally believe. Like I don't know which one it would be. I'd probably lean more towards what society thinks because of how reliant we are on social structures. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, but I also just think like Jung, like if we're adhering to these like roles or archetypes, they are kind of the framework in which we should act, and each of them would have their own sets of like moral boundaries relating to that as well. So like if we're a mother, or if we're the funny guy, if we're the joker, like that would have its own kind of like guidelines or boundaries, and maybe that would more be the boundary, because I see the shadow very much as quite personal. But I think you're right, as it would have to come from somewhere. It's learnt somehow. You're learnt to suppress them and to not show them for a reason because it's not accepted.
Yeah.
But you've chosen to select that. Like, that's very crafted. personally.
I don't view the shadow as something you've crafted. I think it's just a cause of having an ego. Like if you dissolve your ego, you dissolve the shadow. Like I kind of see it like from the top down, say your ego is like a triangle. It casts a triangle shadow underneath it. And whatever fits within the triangle shadow
Yeah.
is what is in your shadow self. But if your ego was a circle, you would have different characteristics to your shadow. This is like a really convoluted analogy.
You just like what is part of your ego has to be like the shadow comes directly from the ego.
Yeah.
And it's just a reflection of like suppressed urges that live in the depths, and that's just because it's ego. Like
Yeah. Well, I think that's just because the ego has an agenda or it just wants to survive and have things be as easy as possible with as little conflict internally as possible. And for it to do that, it chooses what to suppress and to put in the shadow. Because if those things came out of the shadow, it would be a danger to the ego.
yeah.
And that's why it suppresses it. And that's why it's unconscious as well. Because if it wasn't unconscious, it would be in your conscious mind and it will be conflicting with your ego.
Yeah.
And one would have to go
Yeah.
to be internally congruent.
Yeah. Well, that kind of shows that it's when you said like internally congruent, which is Roger's theory. Roger. So how do you think his theory of like incongruence would relate to that?
Well, I think it's just the same as what I've been saying. Like, I think the nature of how things work in general is a type of balance. And if you had the shadow at the same conscious level as your ego, there would be a lot of conflict. And if those things were on level playing field, they'd be clashing together a lot. And if there's a lot of clashing, then there's not much overlap. Like I imagine the ego is on top of the shadow. And if it's perfectly on top of the shadow, then you're congruent to a point where there's no like conflicting areas. It's a terrible like explanation, but congruence is like two circles and how much they overlap. And if you imagine the ego is a circle and the shadow is a circle, then it would be the same. Like if the ego and the shadow were perfectly overlapped, then you would be congruent. Those circles would become one circle.
Aligning.
And so whatever needs to pass through can pass through easily. But if they were separate or only a little bit overlapping, the cross section is smaller. And I feel like that would correlate to how much peace you would feel or content or whatever the word you want to use is.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because like for congruence, so if I haven't stated it already, it's congruence is like your self-image and your true self aligning like together as one, represented. And then incongruence is when like what you're portraying externally is not what you're feeling internally. So the shadow would have to be understood, like as you're saying, like it has to be aligned with how you're perceiving yourself.
Yeah.
So your true self. Like you have to know why, you have to have a bit of an idea of what's going on, like what the things you are repressing are, kind of where the sore spots are for you and what you would be trying to shun and why it's uncomfortable for you. I think that you would need to have a bit of an understanding of that to actually portray yourself truly on the exterior, like your self-image.
Yeah. I think it's a difficult balance because there's only so far you can go into your shadow because it's unconscious. Like it's your shadow for a reason. It's not like easily retrievable, like the information that's in there. So I don't think it's necessary to understand what's in there, but it's necessary to understand that it exists, and that's where conflict can come from. And if you need to figure out what the conflict is, then you can infer it from what is being aggravated in your ego.
Yeah. What the uncomfortability is.
Yeah.
Like, what is it about what someone's doing or saying to you that is aggravating the ego? Like, why are you upset by this? Is it really that act, or like what are they saying about you or inferring about you, or what are you perceiving as that?
Yeah.
To aggravate it. And I think that's when you can realize like we all have a shadow. We all have these things that will aggravate us and make us not feel amazing. But like understanding that that's there, and that when we have negative feelings or feelings of like inferiority, and when we need to go try and put on an ego to cover that up, like why is it that that's occurring? You know, why is it that it's happening?
Yeah.
And I feel like that leads into Alfred Adler's inferiority-superiority complex.
Well, I think also along that line of thinking, like your ego and your shadow are both necessary. Like how I've kind of talked about it in the past is the ego is something you want to dissolve, is probably the word I would have used. Like the more dissolved your ego is, the better. But I don't think it's about dissolving it or removing it.
No.
It's just about understanding what it is to the point where the parts about it that aren't working for you in the way that you want to live your life, you can change. Because it's necessary to live in this world dimension reality, or whatever you want to call it. Because if you didn't have an ego,
you wouldn't have an identity or an internal image of yourself. Which is hazardous to humanity, because we need an identity in order to make contributions and like express, like self-expression. And creativity comes from a place of like ego and looking at the shadow or the parts that are more repressed. And a lot of the time it just comes out in creative acts like singing or art or something like that.
And I think if you were to fully dissolve your ego in an unconscious world, you could run yourself into the crossfire of something that is unconscious. Like even an animal, like I would use, if you fully dissolved your ego and you had no identity, then it wouldn't matter if you were alive or dead, really, because it would be the same for you regardless. And so in order for life to
Instru.
Is that a word?
Yeah.
Instru. To carry on, for you to have the urge to have sex, make offspring, take care of them, and live as long as you can.
Yeah.
Like that would dissolve as well. And so the human race would just die out, or anything that had dissolved its ego. So I think it's a construct of even evolution, like to push the species further.
Yeah.
So you sort of have more of a will to live.
Yeah. Like we have those like id or primal urges for a reason.
Yeah.
Like we need to reproduce, we need to take care of our offspring. Like there's things that if we didn't have the urge to do, like our humanity would just cease to exist.
Yeah.
But I think it's like going back to what you were kind of saying about knowing your shadow, or like I was thinking another way to frame it in terms of like common language is like triggers. It's just like knowing what triggers you and why, and like deciding, oh, I actually want to know like why it's triggering me, so that it loses some of its power over you.
Yeah.
Like it's empowering to actually step into it a bit, because yes, it's uncomfortable at the start, but then you realize why it's happening to you, why you're feeling this way.
Yeah.
And it might not be instantaneous, like when it first happens, but then when you reflect on it, you're like, oh, I got really angry at that because they said something about this part of me, and that makes me uncomfortable because I know it's not where I want it to be.
Yeah. If you understand what a trigger is, which is like,
a shadow,
a part of your shadow coming up and sparking against your ego. Yeah. And it's good to realize that neither of those are you. Like, you're not your ego, so you're not your shadow either. And it's easy to be able to change the ego when you want to, when you don't identify with it. Like, if you believe that, like, who you are is your ego and you have to defend that, then you're pretty much defending your own misery, because you're locking yourself in a cage willingly, knowing that there's a lot of things that you don't like about yourself. Like, I think that's just human nature.
Yeah, but I think that step of unlocking and not identifying with ego is like the biggest step to take, or the biggest kind of leap of faith, because it's really uncomfortable at the start.
I don't think it's binary though either. Like, I don't think you either. Like, it's kind of a spectrum and across all areas of life. And it fluctuates all the time depending on.
But I think even when you first start to deliberate the fact that like maybe everything that I've been taught, or like how I act, maybe that's just a response due to my circumstances, or maybe like.
But that's what it is, yeah.
Yeah. So, but you realize like, oh, maybe that is why it's happening. Maybe it's not me. Maybe I don't like that's the realization that is strange at the start, because that's all you're taught, or all you're identified with. Or it's like how other people view you as well, and how you're like reinforced to act.
Yeah. I think it's important to come back to the idea of that. It's important to have an attachment to that identity, because if nothing triggered you, then there will be no reason to change or get better as well. So it's like a balance. You got to hate yourself enough to change, but love yourself enough to make the change.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think a lot of what society is kind of promoting, whether it's conscious or not, is there's kind of two schools. There's the side that wants to remove the ego entirely, and there's one that wants to identify with the ego entirely. And I think what we've just realized is you want to be in the middle of that.
Yeah.
Because on either end, it kind of removes the emphasis or the importance of life at all.
Yeah. I think that also comes down to like the idea that this is kind of something that I have been thinking about, is that like extreme views or just extreme decisions of anything is like amplified, and centrism is like always negative, or not even negative. It's just like not fed into at all, because it makes there's no fire there. There's no like,
it doesn't validate
flame.
Anyone's ego.
No, it doesn't. It's like, oh, making something a decision of half of this person and half of that person, or like coming to a deliberation is usually so hard, just because we're fighting for a side, because it feels the best for our ego to fight with.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, like let's fire it up.
Yeah.
And it's addictive.
Yeah. It's just, if you're not congruent with yourself, to go back to that, it's very difficult to sit in the middle like to be ambiguous. And if you're incongruent, you're sort of grasping for either end of the spectrum just for a bit of certainty.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the way the world has been built is to force us into being uncomfortable in the ambiguity, but that's where unity is, because no one is ever one or the other. We're a mixture of everything. So it's important to be able to sit in ambiguity for a long period of time if you need to. And
Well, I think it's just deliberate the both sides.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not like it's like take on information from both sides and really, really think about it and really like sit with it and try and, because that's the truth is always somewhere in the middle of everything.
But that's what ambiguity is. It's sitting there and taking every information, because a lot of people just, the first thing they hear, that's what they believe.
Well, if it goes within their prior beliefs.
Yeah.
Then yes. But if it doesn't, then it's defense.
But that's already jumping to a conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like we can go back to it again, sometimes that's necessary. Like if you need to make split-second decisions to survive, like someone's pointing a gun at me.
Yeah.
Try and incapacitate them to save yourself. Like that's a good split decision.
Yeah.
Rather than if someone wasn't pointing a gun at you, making a split decision to incapacitate them.
Yeah.
Is not a good idea. Like it's good to be able to do both.
Yeah. I was also just going to say something else on self-image and like true self. So this is kind of somewhat unrelated, but I also think it's interesting. There was a study about when Facebook first was starting to get popular, introverts using Facebook, and it was found that through using Facebook, they were able to express their true self more easily. And because it was less restricting to express themselves online, because it gives you like more control, because you have like time to react and like you know what you want to say, and you like kind of can like figure out what your true intention behind like a post or a meaning or a message is. And it actually had some good effects for people that were finding like just the normal world quite suppressing, I guess, because I think usually I think of social media as I've got like a negative tinge towards it, but if you can express your true self in as many modalities as possible, or express that, so like social media or like one-on-one with a person, it makes it easier to go out to the world to continually express your true self when you've shown yourself it's safe to do it in like on the platform of online or with one person, like something like that, which I think is like interesting because it shows you that there's levels to expressing
persona.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Like when you begin to create content, especially, and when you do it often and you're trying to like figure out what other people resonate with, like what parts of you resonate with other people. But I think it's been taken to an extreme today now, where what other people want is more important than the authentic expression of what I am.
Yeah. I mean, the study that I was referring to was at the start of Facebook, and it was not people with an online platform. It was like people trying to connect with their friends and family on Facebook.
Yeah.
But they were able to do so without like the judgment or like the anxious tendencies that they have in the external world. So it made them, easier to express their truth on there, which then made them like, oh, they've already said their truth. Now they can keep sticking with that in the external world.
Yeah, it's funny. I was on Facebook when I was young, like kind of went in the beginning. And it was fun then because it was just your friends and family and you could be yourself because the people are going to see it, in real life anyway.
Yeah.
So you have there's a little bit of separation so you could be a bit more yourself, but you're not exposing yourself to strangers. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. It just reminded me of, I remember when I was, I don't know how old I would have been, like 12. And I took a bunch of pictures of myself in different face emotions. And I was going to change my profile picture depending on what emotion I was. So if I was happy, I would put the picture up of me with a smile. And if I was pissed off, I'd put up a picture of me pulling a cranky face. That's just a really creative way of
yeah,
expressing that.
Well, I guess it's kind of like status updates.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
But they eventually did.
Yeah.
Maybe they got it from you.
I mean, I think I was after that point, but yeah.
Yeah.
It's very funny.
I think the last concept we should just briefly touch on is Adler's inferiority complex. So basically we act in a way of superiority when we're feeling inferior. And this is kind of linked to studies on narcissism too, honestly, because people generally with narcissism have very fluctuating low to high self-esteem. So they present with very high self-esteem when they're actually in feeling low self-esteem, which could be related to Alfred Adler's theory of inferiority. When we're feeling inferiority, we have a need to feel liked or accepted, or it's harmful for the ego and we don't feel like we belong. So we put on this front of superiority to kind of protect ourselves from that feeling.
Yeah.
But really it then detracts or reflects people away because it's such a hard exterior.
Yeah. But I think it exists because it's important to protect yourself from potential threats. If you were, really that whole thing is just to protect your vulnerability from people who might
mock it or disagree with it.
What's a more overall way of saying that? Take advantage of it. And then being able to use it when it's necessary and not or just understand what it's for, and you can then use that to determine whether you're probably feeling more inferior than you should be, or you're trying to pretend that you're more superior than you are. And why that is the case. If you feel inferior and you're putting up a superior front a lot, then there would be a reason for that. Maybe you're not comfortable in a specific situation. If someone is really good at something that you're also good at, and you feel like you have to put up a superior front because you feel inadequate that they might be better than you at something. And you might dig a bit deeper and why is that? And you can really get to the nitty gritty of it all.
Well, I think that's why Adler describes it as a complex. If you have a superiority complex, it's multi-dimensional and it can come out in sneaky little ways. And it's there to serve a purpose or a reason.
Yeah. Is the inferiority complex, is that the opposite?
It's so you put on the superiority complex because of a feelings of inferiority.
But it's never the other way around?
I don't know. I don't think so. Well, so Adler also has that theory of teleology, which is reasonings for everything. So I guess if you are wanting something, or if the ego is wanting something, it will express it in all ways that it can. The extreme version that he talks about is depression and how it's serving a purpose. the acts in which like not wanting to go socialize, like why do you not want to go socialize? Well, he would argue that it is like you are wanting to live the role of the depressed, like you're in the role of the depressed. So if you were to go socialize, that goes against how you're acting, and like that you get stuck in roles, and therefore like you can't get out of them because you're trying to keep this front up of like any kind of psychopathology, like depression or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've just identified with it.
Yeah.
So you need to act in accordance.
Yeah.
To maintain some level of congruency.
Yeah. Which is interesting because I think that's a very unique concept to Adler. Like that's not really ever talked about.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting one. Yeah.
It's kind of a backwards way that you can get trapped in.
Well, it's like you reason for not doing things because you are something else.
And I guess like when people have for a long time identified themselves with something that they aren't actually, and the people that are around them view them as that thing, and they're sort of in so deep that they can't change then. Otherwise,
it's unexpected.
Yeah, it'll look like you're switching up on them.
Yeah. Yeah.
When really the tides were turning deep underneath the surface and you just weren't reflecting that.
But change is always uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I think it's important then to be able to recognize when these small changes occur so that you don't like suppress it, and then all of a sudden you're completely different to who you are portraying yourself to be. Because
or what
it
you're
starts
telling
somewhere.
yourself. Yeah.
And you can't really stop yourself from changing in a particular way. You can influence it, but you can't stop yourself from changing.
Yeah.
It's like you can't stop yourself from aging. Brian Johnson would say otherwise, but do you think the id and the instincts are needs or wants?
Both.
So you're saying that the id has a goal.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it's just like an urge. Yeah.
But if it has a want, that would mean that it has some level of intelligence. Like if it's just a need, it would just be instinctual. But if it's a want, then it can kind of...
I think it arises from like bodily sensations.
But is the id, like, is that what it sends? It just sends bodily sensations?
No, not always. Because it's like it's unconscious. So I think it would act out of like it acts out of your needs, like what you need, like food.
Yeah.
But then the wants would be there to fuel some sort of like agenda that's unconscious as well.
What would that agenda be?
Like an urge, like...
Because I would classify a need would strictly be surrounded by survival and continuation of the species. So it'd be sex, food, sleep, all of that type of stuff. Like they'd be all needs. And wants would be things that aren't directly in line with that goal, but are just pleasure oriented type things like sugar.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I was thinking about like donuts or like want this. And then it has to like mediate, like the ego will then decide if that's possible. And then the superego will be like, well, how morally can we get it?
But it's also like, is it morally good to have it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, well, I shouldn't have donuts. And then it communicates to it. They're just like urges that arise. And I think most of the time they're like chemical or bodily. And like patterns. Like if you've had a donut every day for a week at 4 p.m, you're going to get that urge.
Yeah. So I've got another question then.
Yeah.
Since your ego is obviously not your true self, the id and the superego, that will be separate from your true self.
Yes.
So then does your true self is just indifferent to life?
I think true self is just love.
In whatever form.
It's like compassion, love, kindness, indifference.
It's just
Accepting
unity.
oneness. Yeah.
Would that kind of mean that the superego and the id, or the ego and everything that encompasses it, is not love, unity, oneness?
Yeah.
So our needs for survival and for life is not centered around love,
No,
oneness, and unity.
I don't think so. I think they're kind of separated.
Interesting. Because you do value your own life over others at a fundamental level.
And you should, because there would be nothing else that holds you. Like,
Well, if you didn't have that, like, the human race would just extinguish itself.
yeah. And that's what tells you, like, you need to eat, how much you need to eat. Like, all of that. Because it's like, I think it comes back to the thing of, like, you're in your human body. The human body has ego because it's a human form and it needs ego to operate and to, like, moderate all these urges.
Yeah.
And then, like, the true self is just, like, love and kindness and compassion and expression that wants to express this and has an innate need to, but it's like it's a spiritual being, or like
It's just like a source.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it's spirit or essence or soul. Like, it's conscious, it's loving consciousness.
So then who you are is kind of who you are in this form would be a combination between your true self and your ego.
Yes, because we're here to create things, to build things, to have an identity, to direct and navigate, to build our own life. Like,
And is that then why on Jung's like map,
yeah,
it had ego at the top, in the middle was self, like your true self.
yeah,
And as you go down, you go from conscious to unconscious. And below the self is the shadow. And then below that is the inner world. And above the ego is the outer world. So like what the outer world sees is mostly the ego, a little bit of your true self, and even less of your shadow.
yeah, true.
And to reach the inner world,
Yeah,
you kind of have to go past.
you have to go the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should wrap it up.
Yo, I'm going to rap.
Okay.
I can rap if you want me to.
Okay, let's hear it then.
I side.
Let's not rap it.
Well, with time.
I like the persona that you get into with that.
I side. Yeah.
So that is Freud, Jung, Adler, Rogers, and the interaction between them and what we think links together and how we view it. I hope you got something out of it and enjoyed and made you curious and question.
Let us know if you have any insights.
Yeah. Thank you so much. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.